Okay, we are live, and I would like to thank everyone for joining us on what is our final panel of our Friday conference day. We do have some exciting panels tomorrow, certainly that I'm looking forward to, and this is, of course, our second weekend of what has been a really wonderful and dynamic conference with more terrific talks than I could name. In fact, I can't think of a single talk that I wasn't particularly engrossed in and engaged in. So I want to thank all of the participants for the conference. I want to thank the conference committee for putting this together and for including this important discussion in the program. And just as a little bit of background, this panel will be a discussion rather than papers. I know we've had a variety of formats in our conference thus far, but this one will be a panel discussion where we'll be talking about history and community engagement and public outreach and the presentation of history in kind of a couple of different contexts. And so the panelists who I'm going to introduce here in just a moment are going to provide some insight into the roles and responsibilities of a museum curator, an archivist, and an academic historian. And we'll discuss how we craft inclusive narratives and build archives that center Alaska's diverse communities. I want to acknowledge the Dena'ina people on whose land we're having this discussion. And of course, I'd like to thank the discussants for their thoughtful participation. And so I'm going to take a minute to introduce Francesca DuBrock and Julie Varee. And from there, Fran and Julie and I will just kind of have a discussion about the topic. Fran is going to provide some contextual remarks before we kind of dig in, and then we'll just open things up for questions at the end. And so if anything seems particularly interesting to those of you who are here on Crowdcast and you wish to weigh in, please do go ahead and put your questions in the chat or under the Ask a Question tab. I'll try my best to monitor that, and then we'll go ahead and get to those after I pose some questions to our discussants. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce the both of them, and I'll introduce myself as well. I'm Ian Hartman. I'm Associate Professor and Chair of the History Department, and I've worked with Julie and Fran on Black Lives in Alaska, the exhibit. More recently, we've worked on the Alaska Railroad exhibit. My background has been on the academic side of history, and I'm really grateful to Fran and to Julie and others who've kind of taken me out of my comfort zone to kind of exercise my muscles in public history. I mean, it didn't come naturally to me, but it's something that I have developed a really strong passion for. And so the way that we as historians kind of engage with the public is really, I think, the theme of this talk. I also would want to thank the Alaska Historical Society for having me on their board. This was my last day as a board member of the Alaska Historical Society, and I'm cycling off, and I dearly hope I have the opportunity to work with the Alaska Historical Society again in the future. They're a terrific board doing really terrific work. And so with that, let me introduce Francesca DuBrock. Fran is born and raised in Alaska. She's the chief curator of the Anchorage Museum. She's focused on developing projects and exhibitions that embrace experimental approaches that have sustainability and equity at their core. She has worked as an artist, educator, archivist, and translator in the US and Latin America, and brings a passion for learning from and through the arts to her current work. She holds a BA in art history from Bowdoin College, an MFA from the San Francisco Arts Institute, and a master's in education from Harvard's Graduate School of Education. Julie Varee has lived in Anchorage since 1988 and is the Anchorage Museum's community outreach archivist. She works with BIPOC individuals and organizations to help the museum tell diverse stories through archival collections and public programs. Varee earned a Master's of Library and Information Science from the University of Washington and was part of the team that developed the Black Lives in Alaska Journey, Justice, and Joy exhibition. She helps ensure the museum's Atwood Resource Center, home to its archives and library, is welcoming to all. And so I want to welcome Julie and Fran to this conversation. As you can see, this is some intellectual firepower right here that is sure to invite, I think, a really strong discussion. And so at that, I think what I want to maybe do is just invite the two of you to maybe discuss and or describe for the audience of historians, mostly this being the Alaska Historical Society Conference, who may not be familiar with the process of museum curation and exhibition, the steps required to put together an exhibit. So that's a question to Fran, and then I'll ask questions specific to Julie about describing how you identify potential collections and how you develop and cultivate the necessary community relationships and partnerships. So I'll go to Fran first.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Ian, and thank you so much for inviting us, and to those in the audience for being here to listen. Museum curation in today's world involves a lot of different things. I have some images to share, a little bit of what that process looks like in a way that sort of departs from the more traditional process you might be imagining. But it can range from working directly with artists on installations or exhibitions to generally what is a sort of more blended experience that involves aspects of liaising with artists and other museums, research, sort of traditional research, as well as community outreach and talking with culture bearers and people who hold knowledge in the community. It involves a fair amount of logistics and quite a bit of email. And then there's also the sort of magical, almost like theatrical production side of it, where we do a lot of design and fabrication and installation that sort of brings it all together. I would say most projects involve some element of all of those things. It would now be a good time to show those images, Ian. Okay. So I just wanted to share a little bit of the kind of work that we do, because I think it can be a little bit mysterious sometimes. So I'm going to try to share screen with this application. So bear with me here. All right. So are you seeing the library and archives? These are Julie's slides here. So this is an example of how different narratives are incorporated into exhibitions. This is an artist named Melissa Chimera we recently hosted in Alaska. She's Filipina and Lebanese and is based in Hawaii. And she came to do work around the Filipinx diaspora here in Alaska, and she's done work in Honolulu and also in California. So here she is interviewing a community member named Joshua Albiza Brandstetter. Here's Mita DeWitt in a traditional Tlingit women's house that she created as part of our Extra Tough Women of the North exhibition. Here's Pablo Elguera in the pop-up used Spanish language bookstore that we created in the old People Mover, or in the what is currently the People Mover bus terminal. It was an old parole office, actually, that we took over, painted yellow, and installed all these bookshelves in, and it was sort of became a community space. Here's one of my former students with the Alaska Literacy Program. We were working on taking portraits at the greenhouse over there on the east side of town. Here is one of local mariachi singing in the elevator at one of our events celebrating Hispanic heritage in Alaska. Here is Soledad Lescas. She's a dear friend who recently passed away. Talking about food and culture and what food means to her and her community at a meal that was hosted by two visiting artists as part of a project called Everyone is Welcome Here. And then here's Soledad in the exhibition that materialized out of this project. It was part of the What, Why, How We Eat exhibition. Maybe some of you remember. But here she is standing in front of her portrait. So just an example of how some of this kind of community outreach ends up working its way back into museum exhibitions. Oh, I have one more image. This is an image of of different profiles of folks from the Extra Tough exhibition, Extra Tough Women of the North. We were releasing images that we researched in the archives at the Anchorage Museum and at other archives, profiling different women from Alaska's history. So talking about how exhibitions exist in a physical plane in the museum, but then they often take on a life of their own on social media or in different sort of community forums or programs. And I view all of that as a critical part of sort of the ecosystem of the work that we do. So I will stop sharing now. I just wanted to show a couple of those pictures. And Julie, maybe it's a good time for you to jump in.
So you want us to describe what we do?
Yeah, just a little bit of background. I mean, given the context of the people who are likely on, in attendance in this conference, I mean, we're coming from a background, diverse backgrounds, but, we're as historians, I think there's a general sense of, history is what's in a book right here. And this is what history looks like. And one of the things that I really want to, I think, maybe impress upon folks is that history is happening in all of these other venues, and that there are ways to convey historical narratives, and certainly the work that you're both doing, I think, speaks to that in kind of divergent but also maybe complementary ways.
Mm-hmm. So the archives at the Anchorage Museum help individuals and organizations tell their stories through their belongings. And I think, that differs from, as you said, in getting history through a book, because we help people save, describe, and preserve safely their photographs, documents. Maybe it's an award certificate. Maybe it's a recording. I'm working right now with some recordings from the Polynesian Association of Alaska of this annual event that they have. So they've started a collection here with us. So I really do think of it as storytelling, and it's historical, but it's also now. In the recent Black Lives in Alaska, Journey, Justice, Joy exhibition, there were photographs from the Black Lives Matter protests. So, citizens and the organizations they choose to belong to have histories, but they're still living. And we try to capture all of that in the archives and library.
Yeah, thank you both for the work that you're doing, and also for, I think, demonstrating the ways that these narratives can, I think, reach the public in ways that I think are probably, just being honest here. I've written monographs through university presses, and I suspect that they probably reach maybe a dozen or so people in graduate seminars, and that's probably about it. And that's okay. I mean, that was what my training was in. That I kind of have been resigned to that for a long time. But I think one of the things that's really rewarding to me about certainly the partnerships I've had with the museum and with some members of our community is it's an opportunity to reach just so many more people. And I think to really demonstrate the value of history in these public places, and to bring people these stories, as you're mentioning, Julie, in a way where they can really encounter them and grapple with them, and hopefully kind of bring those conversations to their family and friends. And so I think the next question I want to ask, and just being maybe a little bit faithful to our conference theme, which is conflicting visions of Alaska history. Both of you have expertly highlighted, if not conflicting visions of Alaska history, certainly a more inclusive vision of Alaska history and present, right? And so I'm wondering if you could speak to how you present a more dynamic and inclusive approach to bringing Alaska's history to the public, and describe what kinds of stories and exhibits that you're most drawn to.
Fran, you want to go first?
Trying to unmute. Okay. So growing up here, I left the state for a while to do my education and work. And I found that a lot of folks I encountered out of state had a pretty sort of monotone vision of what Alaska was, usually informed by either like reality television or sort of 19th, 20th century narratives of Alaska. And so I felt like there was just I knew there was so much more diversity and richness within the community that I came from that was clearly not understood. So I get excited about exhibitions that really talk about the people that actually live here and the richness of the stories that are held here. I love working with people. So that happens on pretty much every exhibition I work on. That's a huge privilege of the work that I do. I think another huge privilege is, and that's become a pretty big focus of all of my work at the museum, is helping tell undertold stories. Julie can talk a bit about that in terms of Black Lives in Alaska, but also with this Extra Tough Women of the North exhibition, can't tell you how many archives and things we looked at where, you find a photo of a man and a woman, and the way the photo is tagged in the archive is like Mr. John Smith and wife, or Mr. and Mrs. John Smith. And it becomes really hard to like research individuals when you can't really even find out their names from what has been left in the archival record at the museum. So kind of helping to shed light on some of those forgotten or harder to find stories has been really rewarding. And I think also the moment when you get to see people have that positive experience of seeing themselves and their stories on the wall in the museum is always the most gratifying moment. And from working on Black Lives in Alaska, I think that's something all of us were able to share and experience with that exhibition.
Me? You want me to go? So I think the museum, anybody at the museum would tell you that the leadership here acknowledges that the archives had gaps. So the stories we had weren't complete in terms of multiple perspectives about life in Alaska. And so that's how the outreach position came about in the archives, because we knew we needed to invite more people with various perspectives and ways that they tell the story of their lives here into the archives. And it's been such an honor to be able to work with people around the community. Some of them, have worked with us in other capacities, or we have a long relationship with them, because making sure that the story we tell here does include multiple perspectives is everybody's job. It's not just the outreach person, someone with that in their title. There's everyone on every team thinks about that in the museum and acts on it when they're doing their projects and programs and creating exhibitions. But in the archives and library, there were definite gaps in those stories. So the exhibition that Fran created and that we had the opportunity to participate in was a real boost for bringing in collections and stories from the Black community. We also had a partnership. We still have a partnership with the History Makers that's based in Chicago, and it's the largest database of African American oral and video histories in the United States. And so as part of that, we started out with these 18 people that had been interviewed and recorded by the history makers. So we knew right then we had a good starting point. And then the exhibition happened, and we could just look at the photographs and know, oh, that's someone we should try to contact and get more of their story about life here and their experiences here. And then programs really build trust with communities and with people. And we've been able to just basically hand the keys over to organizations, and people want to tell their stories. They want others to know what their experiences have been here. And so inviting people to create programs has been really a fascinating thing. And those come from all kinds of sources. You know, Jasmine Smith, who's a local entrepreneur and resource for new businesses, had this, and we're going to do this again this year or next year. She had the Black Business Expo here while the exhibition was up, but she's going to have it here again. So we decided we should have an archives table at this event, and we didn't know what was going to happen. We thought, well, you know, we're not as interesting as these people that have beautiful art to sell and other products to sell, but you know, what the heck, we'll just try it and sit there. Well, we had 3 people stop by. One of them is this amazing local artist, and she said, I want to help you reach out to Black elders before they're gone from us. Can I work on some collections with elders from our community? And then another person came over, and this was great. She said, have you ever thought of doing a program with Black root workers and herbalists? And I said, no, because I don't even know what that is. And I said, but how about if you put the program together? And she said, sure, I would love to do that. And it was a great conversation. So I think the whole work of outreach is really the work of partnership and collaboration, because you know, I don't have the same perspective as another Black person in my community. So in that way, it's really rewarding work.
It reminds me of another panel that I was watching. I guess it was last weekend, and David Reamer was making the comment about public history, and one of the things that he commented on was how oftentimes you may go into a project kind of with the story you want to tell, but then there, you know, kind of the public history aspect of this is oftentimes learning about the stories that other people want to tell or other people want to hear, and that for me has been quite an adjustment. And I think kind of what you're describing right there with the, what you call it, the Black herbalists, and it was the other. Yeah, I mean that's not something that I would have that would not have been a story that I would have necessarily registered to tell, not because it isn't important, but because it's not something that I study. It's not something that I have much context for or anything else. But I think it goes to show you, I think, the value of the work that you're doing when you start to kind of open up an archive to a community. Right. And you find out that we have all of these people in this community who have a wealth of experiences and stories and records. You start to tell a very different history. Right. You know, I mean, the history that has so often been told through archives is it's a political history. It's a history of presidents and a history of senators and a history of foreign policy and kind of high politics, which is, sure, I mean, it's very important. I mean, no one's kind of disputing that you know, politics and diplomacy. I mean, all of that stuff is kind of the bread and butter of what historians have done in the past. But I think what's particularly exciting about the moment we're living in is that we can kind of blow up that model. And we can tell all of these different stories, and we can get this really, I think, different insight into our communities. And so I think that's, to me at least, I think the value of really what we're talking about and what I think the 3 of us are trying to do in our own ways. And I think related to the conference, just maybe shifting gears a little bit here, and please do butt in if you wanted to follow up on that. I'm trying to go through the questions and make sure I'm not stepping on anybody's toes. But speaking of conflicting visions, the conference team, I'm wondering if you've ever felt pressure, personal pressure, institutional pressure, community pressure to avoid certain topics. And I think the reason I'm bringing this up is that we live in such a kind of politically divisive era, right? And so the stories that maybe we want to tell, maybe we have a sense in our minds that they're stories that not everybody wants to hear. And so my question is how do the two of you deal with that? And to the extent that you want to share, have you ever encountered a history or kind of an exhibit that maybe you're afraid is going to run into some kind of controversy or some kind of backlash? And if so, maybe just discuss how you've kind of worked through the conflict of building maybe a narrative that you feel like might not have as much community support as you'd like.
I can jump into that one. It's perhaps less history specific, but I work with a lot of artists. And so I think when addressing challenging topics as a curator, I try and keep in the forefront of my brain that, artists have a right to talk about what they're going to talk about. And as a museum, we try and support the creative and expressive freedom of artists. I can give an example of an exhibition that we thought we were going to have some challenges with that incorporated imagery of lynching and a Confederate flag in the painting. And we did a lot of outreach with community members, with our security team, with our VSA, the folks who greet folks coming into the museum. And, that exhibition, there was no controversy, no pushback on it. I am ashamed to say this, but this is the one thing that will stir up controversy is if there is a nude woman on display at the museum. We'll get calls about that, which says something about our culture. But I think as far as, I feel proud to work at an organization that I think has been pretty fearless about taking on different topics. And in my tenure at the museum, the one thing I would point to is climate change having been a topic we've always been working with, but I think it was more something we were sort of doing between the lines a couple of years ago even. And I feel like that conversation has really become front and center in a lot of what we do. And we've stopped sort of apologizing for it. And I personally think that that's where we need to be in that conversation. But I would say that is the one arena that I feel like I've seen a shift in terms of how it's dealt with and how willing we are to talk about it openly.
I actually, when the Black Lives exhibition opened, I freaked myself out because I said, someone's going to come in here and they're not going to like seeing all these Black people in the atrium. You can't avoid it. Something's going to happen. Someone's going to come in with spray paint. And the way my office sits in the archives and library, we've changed what's in the windows, but it used to be just a clear window, and I would see people lining up to pay admission to come in, and I would just watch sometimes when people were lined up. And there was this guy one morning who had on these camo pants, and I said, oh my God, there's people coming in. They look like they're going to do something to that exhibition. Or, I thought that people would be sent over to see it. Like, you have to go see this exhibition. It's awful. There's all these Black people in the atrium, but nothing happened like that. So I think, and we also get a little protection, I think, from the marketing and PR department, because I would ask, well, are there any comments, about the exhibition? How's it going? And they're like, it's fine. So I know there were some things they did not pass on to me because they knew I was freaking out already. But I agree with Fran that I think institutions have to be who they are, and be brave and not be ashamed of their values and their commitment to all people in the community. So once I relaxed, I was so glad that it was there and that people seemed to appreciate it, and ask questions about it, and be really kind of wistful when it was gone, kind of sad when it came down.
Yeah, I'll confess, Julie, maybe not to the same extent as you're describing, but having worked on that exhibit, I kind of anticipated some of the things that you were describing, and I was very encouraged that we didn't see that materialize. And to take it even a step further, just in my time of doing some research on this topic and doing some of these public engagements with Mr. Williams and Mr. Wesley and some other folks in the community, I've been consistently surprised and pleasantly surprised I think how much interest there is in history, right? And I think people are really ready to learn about their communities and to learn about the diversity of their communities, and to learn, I think, different perspectives, and to hear how to hear about the lives that maybe they haven't necessarily thought about too much for one reason or another. And so I think I think that's kind of inevitable to have that fear, particularly, again, because we do live in this moment, right, where we all watch the news, we all open a newspaper from time to time, presumably, and you can't get away from it, right? I mean, I don't think there's any sense in trying to suggest that oh yeah, everything's fine, everybody's kind of on the same page and we all agree. So I think it's fearless is the word, right? I mean, we have to tell stories that are faithful to the evidence, that are faithful to the lives and the experiences of the people who we're trying to spotlight. And I think if we do that, by and large, my experience is similar to yours, right? That I think that people are kind of grateful to engage, and that overwhelmingly, they're kind of open to hearing these new kinds of stories. And that, to me, I think is really encouraging. It maybe suggests that we're not as divided as maybe we think we are. That might be a really naive thing to say, but I think when you actually get in a room with people and when you share these stories, people start to make connections, and they start to kind of go through their own particular histories, and they kind of maybe see some commonalities, or they make some linkages that maybe they wouldn't have made otherwise. And I think in that sense, to pat all of ourselves on the back a little bit here, I mean, I think we're doing a little bit of a service to the community if we can facilitate those discussions. And so, without sounding like too much of a Pollyanna, I hope that's a bit of what we're doing. And so I think this one is related actually to this broader discussion, but I'm kind of curious about both of your professions. Fran, in your capacity as a museum curator, and Julie, in your capacity as an archivist, how has your profession changed over time? And I'd be happy to chime in a little bit with my perspective on history as an academic discipline as well. But I'm really curious if you could maybe just map the trajectory of your respective disciplines over the last 30 or 40 years, and give folks a sense of where it was and maybe where it is now.
You want me to go, Fran? I think archives in the past, there were two things. One, there was really no concern about missing stories. So if a community wasn't part of the collections, then, I think a lot of people really didn't think about that, because the values of the organization and the values of the archivists themselves were not as open. or were not expressed in the same ways. And I think the other thing too is that archivists used to be seen as these maidens, these handmaidens or something that would just take whatever you brought and organize it and preserve it and share it with people. And there was no voice. You weren't supposed to say, this is totally against what we are interested in, or go out and ask people to consider creating a collection because you wanted to make sure their point of view and their perspective is there. So I think there was this false practice of neutrality, and we know that libraries and archives are not neutral, and archivists are not just here to work with materials, but we work with people and communities, and the museum has values and a mission, and that we're part of that. So I think, more archives have outreach positions and people that they want to engage. It's not as insular as it once was. Right now we are in the middle of some renovations in the public space of the archives and library. And what we did was a survey of community members who used the archives. These were mostly researchers and staff. And then we also did a survey with people who had never been in the space. And we asked them questions about the environment and what it felt like in the public part of the archives and library. And so we're doing this renovation so that more people feel welcomed, so that it's a little less, it was kind of spare and clinical. It was white with concrete. We still have the concrete posts, but there's color that's coming in. There's more wood, so it doesn't look like a dentist's office anymore. And so, I think I think that institutions and archives like ours really do care now what community members feel like when they're in our spaces. And I think that's a big and welcome change. I also think that archivists are more they network more with their peers and other institutions. We have a great relationship with the archives and archivists at UAA, APU library on your campus. And that's really helpful and a healthy development. We don't see ourselves as so separate. We're all trying to make sure we do what we do well. So I think that's a good change too.
Well, from a very narrow self-interest, I appreciate doing research in a place that doesn't look like a dentist office. So I approve of the wood and the color.
Well, come in soon. It'll be finished soon.
That's great. I think museums, curatorial positions have, I think, changed and shifted in tandem with the shifts that we're seeing in the way like societies feel about their museums in general. And I think we've seen museums increasingly contending with their legacies as colonial institutions, people questioning notions around, power, access, authority, who has the authority to tell a story. And so, the term curator comes from the Latin word curare, which means to care for. And I think at a very fundamental level, it means our work has shifted to like caring primarily about objects to caring about people and about relationships. I see my work as being, primarily a work of being in relation with people. Even when it has to do with objects, it tends to be thinking about like the story and the peoples behind those things. The museum also just recently rewrote our mission statement, which I think also speaks to how the field is changing and how curators and archivists and all of us, think of our work. Julie mentioned earlier that all of us are sort of really involved in a lot of the key issues we're discussing here. And so I was just going to share, in my 5 years at the museum, the change in language is subtle, but I hopeful it will illustrate something. So we went from being the Anchorage Museum connects people, expands perspectives, and encourages global dialogue about the North and its distinct environment, to our mission being to be a museum for people, place, planet, and potential in service of a sustainable and equitable North with creativity and imagination for what is possible. So I think you see the language really pulling away from this more like academic, like facilitator kind of role into just realizing that we are like part of a society and a culture and a place, contributing to a shared future in that place. And what that looks like is not always reducible to a very sort of academic approach to museum practice.
Yeah, no, I as somebody who worked on a mission statement for the University of Alaska System Office, which is probably not terribly interesting to too many people in this room. It's amazing how that exercise can actually be deeply philosophical. And so, in the context I'm describing, we ended up having these, hour-long discussions about the meaning of very specific words. And so I think these mission statements and how they evolve over time are actually like a really productive way to maybe kind of map how an institution's mission changes. I think they're very revealing. And so I was unaware of that. So thank you, Fran, for sharing that with us. I'll just say, briefly with history, I teach a course on historiography, and which is just a way of saying how history has been done over time. And one of the points that I'll make is that, history has kind of evolved with society. The writing of history has evolved with society. And when we get into the 1960s and 70s, and I don't think it's a coincidence that you start to see much more of a focus on civil rights history, on the history of like maybe the American Indian movement, history of anti-war activism, for example. And so I think that the discipline of history, what you see kind of happen is that it kind of moves with a lot of the social movements that are occurring. And I'm an Americanist naturally, so I can't say that this would necessarily be true if I studied early modern France or something like that. But certainly I think is somebody who's interested in modern American history, I think the field has kind of changed with the concerns of society generally. And there's been this big discussion in history about presentism and about kind of bringing our present values to historical research. And that's maybe a discussion for another day. But what I think is absolutely undeniable when it comes to historians in the context of U.S. history, modern U.S. history, is that the advent of social history, right? Just kind of the history of working people, kind of introducing topics of gender and sexuality, particularly again coming out of the 1960s and 70s. I mean, it's really redefined the field, and I don't think we're ever going back, right? I mean, and nor should we. I mean, I think that the history that we now do over the last really 2 generations now, I think is a much more rich, full history. It certainly isn't immune to public critique and commentary, but generally speaking, I think the quality of the scholarship over the last generation or so has indeed gone up quite a bit, with maybe some notable exceptions. I want to continue to ask some questions, and I've got questions prepped, but I also want to be sensitive to our time and to the fact that others may have questions of their own. And so I do see that David Ramser has posed a question that I think is quite interesting that I want to pose to the two of you, which is, can you describe the process by which the museum selects exhibits? Do you conduct any sort of surveys to determine public interest, take advantage of special dates, 150th anniversary of the Alaska Purchase, or just to take a shot in the dark about what the public will be interested in? And so that's from David. And if others have any questions, do feel free to chime in. I said right around the 45-minute mark, we'll break things open, and that's where we're at right now. So if Julie or Fran, you want to take a stab at David's question.
I can jump in there. So yeah, there are a number of ways that we decide what exhibitions to do. We are constantly being pitched exhibitions by different community members and artists. Staff members. We try and take all of those pitches we receive into consideration. I think people often underestimate how far in advance we plan. And I will say that in the museum field, the Anchorage Museum we work on a much tighter timeline than most other organizations, but even still, our calendar is usually set about 2 years in advance at minimum. But I would like to think that it's never really a shot in the dark. I'd like to think that most of us take our jobs pretty seriously to have a pulse on what's going on socially in our communities and in the nation at large. So, Black Lives in Alaska was an exhibition that was curated on a pretty short timeline because we felt like it was really important to respond to the moment and the energy that we were all collectively feeling after George Floyd was murdered. And so we do those kinds of exhibitions. We also do mark occasionally anniversaries. Like Ian mentioned, we're doing an exhibition on the Alaska Railroad centennial. And we, I think, take into, we try and balance. We're a museum with a really huge mission mandate, art, history, science, culture, that's enormous amount of territory to cover. I know that people, particularly in this audience, maybe won't always be satisfied with how much of a given discipline we have on display. But I think, that also gives us a lot. We have a pretty large building. So at any given time, we could be, working with an individual artist. We could be doing a more history-focused exhibition like the Alaska Railroad exhibition. We also like to incorporate exhibitions about sort of vernacular Alaska culture. So we've done stuff on, traveling on snow flyers, snow machines, skis. We did one on food culture in Alaska. So we try and create things that, will have a broadly accessible moment for every type of person who's coming into the museum. I hope that answers your question a little bit. But it's always a bit of Tetris, and we also borrow exhibitions from outside too. So if there's an exhibition that we think really offers something that would resonate, we will take those. And we do surveys. We do feedback surveys on exhibitions that we've done. Our marketing team has done outreach to just random museum visitors who are coming in about what types of exhibitions they want to see. We do take that into consideration. But our mission is to really reflect our place. So if we get comments, which we have a lot, that people want to see more French Impressionism, that's probably not feedback we're ever going to act on because it's not in keeping with our organizational mission.
I think partnerships too. We have partners in the community who might come up with something and ask us about helping them gain some visibility for a project. And I'm thinking about one thing that's up now in one of the hallways. There's a talented photographer in town, Jovel Rinnie, who has a solo show in the atrium. And he worked on a project with the Rasmussen Foundation. And part of this project were these really terrific portraits that he took of individuals around the state. And so we worked with the Rasmussen Foundation to have those portraits lead into the photographs of his in the atrium. So wouldn't you say, Fran, that sometimes partners, play a role in what the exhibitions are?
Hugely. I mean, I can list so many exhibitions that came about that way. Alaskans and salmon. We worked with 2 salmon folks, the food exhibition with Julia and Liz. We've that's sort of part of just being an open door to our community. You can find both of any of our emails on the website. If you have an idea, you can get in touch. We like to, be listening and be responsive as much as possible.
I don't see any other questions popping up, so I'll go back to one or two of mine in maybe our last 10, 15 minutes or so. But again, if anybody does wish to weigh in, please feel free to either type it into the chat or under the ask a question. I'm doing my best to monitor both, and so I'm sure I'll see it if you leave it in either place. But how about just as maybe one of the concluding questions that I was going to ask is a project or article or publication or something that you've completed that you've been particularly proud of. In the case of you, Fran, I would imagine it's probably an exhibit. Maybe, Julie, it might be kind of a collection that you've secured. I'm just curious if there was something that you're really excited about or proud of. And I know for me, if I can just jump in first, I'll say briefly, it was the work that we did on the Black Lives in Alaska. Both connecting with the community, but also the exhibit and the Park Service and the series of, I think, community connections and networks that came out of that. And I'm curious if you guys have had similar experiences, because that was really rich and meaningful for me.
I do want to tell this story about this one thing that I used to work in the development department, in the fundraising department, and Lukey Tobin worked there. And for one thing, it was the first time I worked with another Black person in a department. Lukey is so sharp. And so we used to walk through the museum, we're going to lunch or whatever. And one of us would see a Black person or a Black family, and we'd run to each other and say, "There's a Black family in the museum. Come out." And we'd go out and look at them, or we would go talk to them, because it was a rare thing to see people of color in the museum. And now when the Black Lives exhibition was up, I remember saying, "There's a white family in the exhibition," and they're reading the labels and really looking at the exhibition. And so it was really funny to me when I thought about that flip. I think something that we can all be proud of, that staff can be proud of, is I think our mission is pretty out there. It's pretty clear. Our devotion to inclusion and the work that we're doing that is less traditional, maybe, from what the museum was. So helping this institution evolve and change, as all organizations do. Healthy organizations do that, and healthy people do that. And I think that's something we can be proud of, all of us.
That's such a nice ending note. I hate to say anything after. Health change is healthy. I think for me, as far as a large exhibition, I would point to the Extra Tough exhibition, just to give an example that hasn't been voiced yet in this conversation. One of the things I was most proud of with that exhibition is that it incorporated contemporary art, archival photos, historical objects, and also like videos from social media, like TikToks. And we displayed everything sort of in a really intentionally like non-hierarchical fashion. So it was all part of telling the story of women in Alaska. And
interviews.
And the interviews, and we had community contributions, and we tried to put people's actual voices in the label text, in all of the labels. And I had a young anthropology student who was visiting from out of state see the exhibition and write me an email, and she was just so excited by seeing something like a TikTok next to a historical object, next to an archival photo. It's kind of crazy in the year, well, I guess then it was the year 2020, that doing something like that is still perceived as like sort of radical in a museum. I think, it's not radical for the Anchorage Museum. And so I maybe take that a little bit for granted, forget that a lot of people are toiling at much larger, older institutions with a lot more barriers to doing that kind of work. And for me, I was just most proud of how like collaborative and democratic that exhibition felt.
So maybe related, and I think we have time for maybe just one or two more questions. And again, I'm keeping an eye out here for others. But I'm curious what you think is the future of your profession. I know this has been a big topic of discussion again, particularly like in a university setting. Like, what is the future of the humanities? What is the future of the history major? And naturally, I'm a staunch defender of the history major. I'm a staunch defender of the humanities. But yet, I'm also someone who's kind of at my wit's end about how we do have to change. I think the typical way that certainly history PhD programs and the history major at the undergraduate level have kind of operated in the past of, here's your menu of 4 or 5 classes. Here's your research paper that you write at the end of this process. Here's the dissertation that you write to get your PhD. I think that I think if we continue to do that, we're probably going to end up executing the discipline, at least academically. And I worry about that. I worry about it a lot because I think we need to be a little bit more nimble. We need to be, I think, a little bit more public facing. We need to kind of translate to the community, to the public, to whoever, that what we do does have this value, and that we're able to, I think, kind of connect it to broader issues of critical thinking and quality writing and research. And that's something that historians, I don't think, have had the most success doing lately. And so I'm really keen to maybe hear your insights about how you see the history of your profession maybe evolving into the future.
I'll go. I think there's more of an emphasis on accessibility. I think COVID-19 kind of did us a favor in that way, because in order to stay relevant and stay and continue serving people during that time, we had to do things virtually. And it was, there's a little fear that it's not going to be as good an experience. But I think people really did take advantage of that accessibility. So I think that's something in the future of at least the Anchorage Museum's archives, that we're more focused on accessibility now. So you don't have to come here to find out what is in the archives. You don't have to come here to see a photograph that you might be interested in, or an object on the other collection side. And I think that is truly an important thing, because for one thing, we had programs, virtual programs, where people were from across the United States and are curious about Alaska and about our museum and the programs we were having. And so that was really great to see people from across the United States. And I just think accessibility is the name of the game for the future.
Yeah, I have a follow-up to that, but I want to hear Fran's comments.
Well, I mean, to your point, Ian, about like the field and sort of the credentialing that goes along with it, I think that's a huge issue for museums. I'm proud to say that I don't think it's a huge issue at the Anchorage Museum. I don't have a PhD, which is pretty much unheard of, I think, in many institutions for a chief curator. I have 2 master's degrees. Most of the folks on my team come from a variety of different academic backgrounds, as opposed to like a straight museum studies track, which I think makes us more nimble and creative and able to think outside the box. I hope that's the way museums are moving in general, because I think this credentialing can really be a way of gatekeeping and keeping the profession not reflective of the people that live in America. So I would say that I think museums in general are undergoing just this massive moment of transformation right now. And I'm kind of excited to see where it leads us. I think already we do so much work that isn't contained in the building. Like my colleague, Erin Leggett, who I know most of you know, has been doing so much work on Dena'ina place names outside the museum. We do so much work in the community outside the museum. Increasingly, what I hear from community members is like that the number one asset in their minds of the museum is the space that it provides for gathering, for activities. Julie Varee mentioned the Black Business Expo. Like, I think that museums are increasingly becoming more sort of sites of community gathering and exchange, as opposed to places to, you know, come and learn and be in a quiet environment and have your moment of reflection. Although I still, a little piece of me still wants a little part of that to hang on. You know, we have lots of different areas of expertise held within a museum that I think in the future, imagining like how that becomes accessible to the community is interesting. Like, how could our design expertise, you know, contract with others who are wanting to draw on their expertise? How are we engaging, partnering with, or working with other organizations? I know we do a lot of that already, but I imagine that partnership will change and become more radical in the future. I don't know. It's clear that the old model is not where we want to be. So I'm curious to see what the future brings.
You know, I want to add something too. Something you said made me think about how, you know, we're always reminding people when we do programs off-site, or even when we do them here, you know, the archives doesn't want to just get your stuff. You know, that's not the point of it. If you want to have an archives in your community, or you want to keep what you have in your home, then we can help you if you have questions about how to preserve your photos and other materials, your documents. You know, if you want to share, we can talk about how you can let more people know about what you have that's a part of your story and your organization's history. And I think that's a change too, that archives are more willing now to support other archives that are not in our building or in another traditional space, that community archives are being supported by quote unquote traditional repositories. You're muted, Ian.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Julie. I see we just have about 5 minutes left, and it's a Friday evening, so I suspect people are probably going to be getting on with their evenings. But I did want to just maybe throw things open and ask you guys for any kind of final words or things that excite you about the future of your profession, the future of the field. We've addressed this, I think, a little bit. And I guess before I throw it back over to the two of you, I do see a comment, which is that in addition to artists in the schools, there should be a historian in the school's program. And I would actually even take it a step further. I feel compelled to comment on this because I've always advocated for a kind of a White House historian. Like there should be an historian on the chief of staff in the White House, and like a good historian too, not just any historian. Maybe that's something of a deeper discussion, but yeah, I fully support that. Absolutely. I think that's a terrific idea, Sue. I endorse it 100%. So yeah, any kind of final comments that you might want to share about, anything about the future of what's going on at the museum, about public engagement, about your respective professions and disciplines, kind of a wide open way just to wind us down.
I don't know. That one's hard. When we were talking about the earlier question, I was trying to remember a quote from this educational theorist that I like named Maxine Greene. And it sort of speaks, it speaks to, in speaking about like the field, museums changing, going through this transition, reckoning with their really problematic histories. I think I also want to make space for recognizing the importance of a space for art in our communities and a space for creativity and a space for collaboration. And like, I'm not thinking, just about art. I think about like the exhibition we worked on, Black Lives in Alaska, like having those big photographs, having the cover of Ebony magazine, getting to see those images, I think does something really powerful to the mind. So I was going to just share, in light of the divisiveness in our society right now, which was also mentioned, this quote, which she says, "Imagination is what above all makes empathy possible. That is because of all our cognitive capacities, imagination is the one that permits us to give credence to alternative realities." So just a little plug for sort of the power of storytelling, of history, of art in the public space, and why I hope that we change, but that we sort of preserve that as a core tenet.
Yeah. It's a great quote. I appreciate that. Thanks, Fran. Yeah. What do you think, Julie?
Just closing words.
I think so.
I really appreciate the people who take a chance and figure out what we're doing here. I appreciate the community members who help us reach out to their peers and other families and students and interns. I think it says a lot that we work with artists who become residents, who have gigs here. I just think that the community should be proud of this museum and what it has tried to do and what it does accomplish. And I'd like to see more people from the community become involved at the museum and provide the kind of feedback that helps us grow and be better at what we do.
Yeah. Yeah, I certainly appreciate that. And I guess just my maybe final remark is that and it overlaps with that, is that I think in response to my earlier concerns about, kind of the modern university and the role of the humanities, I think the thing that's going to save us is our ability to be in the community and to kind of, for folks at the university to have a connection with the museum, and folks at the museum to have that connection to various communities here in Anchorage, and for us to be really, I think, intentional about the stories that we're telling. And I think, when we do that, people will see the relevance of history in their everyday life, and they'll want to come, and they'll want to major in history. They'll want to come to the museum and walk through the exhibits and spend time. And as you pointed out, Julie, for that white family you mentioned, reading the Black Lives in Alaska, each of the plaques and each of the little paragraphs, I think that's exactly what we need to do. And I think, to use Fran's point about being fearless, I think we need to do that fearlessly, and not be afraid of the stories that we have to share, because people might again find more commonality than maybe they would have thought going into it. So I do have optimism. I do believe that, the future of the humanities and history is bright. I just think it's a question of maybe communicating it. And that's something that we all, of course, need to do. And it's something that the two of you do so expertly well. And I want to thank you both. And I want to thank everybody here for tuning in. This will be made for those who were unable to join us. The video will soon be up, and we certainly invite you to share that. And I want to invite everybody to log on tomorrow morning. I'll be moderating a panel at 9 a.m. and I think we have at least 2 others. And I know we have the bar tour tonight, I believe, at 7 o'clock. So there's lots going on with the Alaska Historical Society Conference 2022. And again, I want to thank our guests, Fran DuBrock and Julie Varee, for sharing their expertise and their insights with us. This has been a really great panel, and I want to thank everyone for tuning in. So have a great weekend, one and all.